Hi, everyone. My name is Beth Keene, and I am the CEO of Holocaust Museum LA. Thank you for joining us for our Building Bridges series, which brings together leaders from diverse communities for important conversations about working toward common social justice goals. And we just realized that this may be our 2-year anniversary of the program, which started in response to the death of George Floyd that happened in May of 2020. So major shout out goes to our board member, Dan Schnur, who has been moderating these panels for us for the last 2 years. Thank you, Dan. Jewish and LGBTQ plus communities were targeted by the Nazis because of their identities. Today, nearly a century after Hitler came to power and began his attempt to propagate an Aryan master race, Jewish and LGBTQ plus communities are still being targeted around the globe with hateful rhetoric and are increasingly victims of hate crimes. This month, as communities come together to celebrate Pride Month, LGBTQ plus communities continue to face discrimination, hate, and violence, including the thwarted attempt by 31 members of a neo-Nazi group who conspired to riot at a Pride event in Idaho last weekend. This evening's discussion focuses on working together to combat hate and challenge identity-based persecution. The museum's work is more critical than ever, given the fragile state of today's world, with the war in Ukraine, humanitarian and refugee crises, and the alarming rise in hate crimes targeting diverse communities. A study by the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism revealed that anti-Jewish and anti-gay hate crimes increased by more than 50% last year, and that Los Angeles recorded the most hate crimes of any US city this century in 2021 alone. 2022 is set to break records for anti-LGBTQ legislation, with hundreds of bills introduced across the United States, particularly targeting the transgender community. We must take action, and education is our greatest catalyst for change. Holocaust Museum LA's mission is grounded in teaching students and visitors the critical lessons of the Holocaust and its continued social relevance, empowering them to speak out and stand up against hatred, bigotry, and anti-Semitism. We strive to build a culture rooted in kindness, empathy, and treating people with respect. Students enter our museum as bystanders and exit as upstanders. In celebration of Pride Month, we are pleased to welcome community leaders for a productive discussion on how our communities can join together to fight discrimination and counter hate. Senator Scott Wiener represents District 11 in the California State Senate. Among his many committee and caucus assignments, he serves as vice chair of the California Legislative Jewish Caucus and immediate past chair of the California Legislative LGBTQ plus caucus. In the Senate, Senator Wiener works tirelessly to safeguard and expand the rights of all communities. Senator Wiener has dedicated much of his life to supporting the LGBTQ plus community since 1990, when he came out in the middle of the AIDS crisis as a college student in North Carolina and volunteered on an AIDS crisis hotline. Over the last 3 decades, Senator Wiener has been one of the strongest LGBTQ plus civil rights champions in the nation. Rabbi Denise Eger is the founding rabbi of Congregation Kol Ami in West Hollywood. She has served pulpits in Canada, New York, and Los Angeles, edited 2 books, authored articles for numerous publications, and is co-author of the official reform movement, Gay and Lesbian Wedding Liturgy. Rabbi Eger is a noted speaker on the topics of human sexuality, LGBTQ plus issues, and Judaism. She has won numerous awards for her dedication and activism. Alisha Pedowitz is a board member of JQ International, the premier LGBTQ plus Jewish organization in Los Angeles. JQ ensures inclusion through community building, educational programs, and support and wellness services. Alisha also serves as the California Director of Moving Traditions, a nonprofit dedicated to emboldening Jewish youth to challenge gender stereotyping and other forms of discrimination. She's made her career working with teens, working as an educator and communal professional at Jewish camps, schools, and agencies throughout California. Holocaust Museum LA is the first survivor-founded and oldest Holocaust museum in the country and home to the West Coast's largest collection of Holocaust-era artifacts. Admission is free for all students and for California residents. We bring you programs like this Building Bridges webinar at no charge. If you're enjoying our programs, we ask that you consider supporting our work by making a donation to the museum at holocaustmuseumla.org. It's now my pleasure to introduce the moderator of today's program, Museum Board Member Dan Schnur. Dan's a professor at USC Annenberg School of Communications, UC Berkeley's Institute of Governmental Studies, and Pepperdine School of Public Policy. Dan, thank you so much for helping us start this amazing Building Bridges series and for serving as today's moderator. And I will kick it over to you now.
Beth, thank you so much. Thanks also to our three panelists for joining us for tonight's very, very important conversation. But most importantly, thanks to all of you who join us each month for these discussions. As Beth mentioned, 2 years ago, in the immediate aftermath of the tragic deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, we decided that an additional service that we could provide as a museum is to build bridges between our community and others who face similar challenges throughout the Southern California region and beyond. And since that original program back in June of 2020, we've held discussions with the Latino, the Black, the Asian Pacific, the Muslim community, as well as conducted intergenerational conversations and conversations about building bridges within the Jewish community for those of us of different backgrounds and different heritages. But we feel like today's discussion is a particularly important one because the concept of building bridges from the very beginning has been for us to first to identify common ground, but then also to identify common goals with which we can work together going forward. Our Jewish community, as you all know, is an extremely small percentage of the overall population of this country. And in order for us to make change, we need to make alliances. We need to build bridges. We need to reach out. And that's what tonight's conversation is about, as is the case when we gather every month. As Beth's already told you about our three panelists, and I'll just say briefly, I'm thrilled to have each of them here, not just because of what all three have done and continue to do on behalf of such important causes, but because I think they represent, and I think you'll agree with me too as we move through the hour, they represent three extraordinarily important yet somewhat different perspectives and play somewhat different roles in this work. And so I'm going to ask each one of our panelists as we get this conversation started to talk about the role that they play in the work that they do. So Rabbi Denise Eger, if I can start with you. You're a religious leader, you're a community leader. In that role, in those roles, what's the message that you deliver to the Jewish community about the importance of forming alliances, of building bridges?
Thank you, Dan. It's a real honor to be here, and thank you to Beth Keane, to our CEO of the museum, for all her hard work, to my fellow panelists. Happy Pride Month, everybody. Dan, I'm starting my 35th year as the rabbi of Los Angeles LGBTQ plus community. I've served this community for more than 3 decades, and one of the things that I have learned in the course of this time is that it's really important as we build bridges is not to think about the gay community over here and the Jewish community over there, but that Jewish people are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, non-binary, gay men, and our families. And we're very much a part and parcel of the Jewish community. So something that is really important for us to understand is that when we talk about building bridges to the LGBTQ community, we also have to center the voices of LGBTQ plus Jews as part of that conversation. So I'm very honored to be here as part of that. I think there's principles of allyship. And one of the things about building bridges is to get to know one another, to not make assumptions about each other, and to build strong bonds of becoming an ally. Now, what does that mean to be an ally? To be an ally is to have, first of all, an awareness not of that all of us are created b'tselem Elohim, as we say in Hebrew, a Jewish theological principle that everyone's created in the divine image. When we can acknowledge it, that there's not an other, it's just about all of us as human beings, and we can assert the humanity of everyone. We can begin to start a conversation on equal footing. And that's really, really important, that sense of equality and that sense of equal footing. This next part of being an ally is to have this awakening, almost like Adam and Eve had an awakening in the Garden of Eden, if you will, that their eyes were opened to the world around them, and indeed open to the pain and suffering that's in the world. And so when you're an ally, you have to open your own eyes first to your own privilege, and second to the situation of those that you are in dialogue with and in communion with. And this is a really important part of the Jewish community, is principles, I think, is not just to pick up the mantle, but to begin to also listen to the stories of those you want to be in dialogue with, to really take them in. So I would say that in the Jewish world, this is really, really important for all of us to begin to center the voices of LGBTQ plus Jews in this conversation, to invite LGBTQ plus Jews into the larger communal structures. And that is a big way we can begin together to build bridges and to build relationships with one another and to know each other's stories and to get to know each other's lives, concerns, and issues.
Rabbi Eger, so many good points, and I'm eager to follow up on several of them with you as we go through the hour. But one thing in particular that you pointed out that I think is especially important for us to remember is even the term, the title of our series, Building Bridges, implies two different groups on two different land masses. And there are Black Jews, there are Latino Jews, and certainly there are LGBTQ plus Jews. And so remembering that those bridges aren't being built from one community to another, but often within a community, is such an important way to think about this conversation. Several other things I want to ask you about to follow up as well. But first, I want to bring Alisha Pedowitz into this conversation, because Alisha, you've done such phenomenal work at JQ International and from so many other platforms. And I guess my question to you to get us started is, as an educator, working with young people who are just formulating the way they think about these kind of challenges, these kind of goals, these kind of journeys. As an educator, what do you try to teach young people about how to confront the types of challenges that Rabbi Eger has been talking about?
Thank you so much, Dan. And again, I just wanted to echo the thanks to the Holocaust Museum of LA and my fellow panelists. I'm honored to be in this conversation with you, and to you, Dan. And I would say, by way of answer to that question, in many ways, I'm going to pick up on so many of the things that Rabbi Eger said that I wholeheartedly agree with. And in many ways, I feel like I would flip it, that my job as a Jewish educator isn't necessarily to teach young people that. In many ways, I continue to learn from them. I think that young people today and young people in general are far more expansive in their thinking than those of us who have grown up, thinking about things in certain ways, and our understandings, and I say I don't want to do the othering, as an older person in an older generation of gender, of sexual identity, of all different forms of identity, right? I know that my understandings of those things are being expanded by the young people that I work with, who are able to see much more expansively truly what it means to be created b'tselem Elohim, in God's image. One of the things that I really believe in the work that I do that drew me to being a Jewish educator, and as part of the work that JQ International does, where I feel very lucky to serve as a board member, is to really say that every person is inherently created in the image of God, and the way that we get closer to being able to understand the image of God is through getting to know each individual person, and each person that we interact with expands that understanding because there is a piece of them that is part of that unique image, right? And so the work of education, the work of educating our community to center more and more voices is to help us celebrate and really, as a community, become closer to seeing the fullness of God's image by the more and the more and the more that we include as part of that we're celebrating and including and seeing and affirming and supporting.
Once again, just so many concepts that I want to follow up on, and you're exactly right. As an educator, also, I should have known better. And learning is a two-way process. And I can only imagine the way the young people you work with enrich your thinking, but I can also only imagine all the good work you do for them. And I want to dig a little bit deeper on that in just a couple minutes. But finally and belatedly, I'd like to welcome our final guest, last but certainly not least, State Senator Scott Wiener. And though Beth gave the senator a very complimentary introduction, I should tell all of you that it was just a bit limited because in addition to the work that Scott Wiener has done tirelessly on behalf of the LGBTQ plus community, he is also one of our state's leaders on housing and transportation issues, on healthcare issues, on climate change policy, on too many issues for us to cover over the next 41 minutes. So Senator Wiener, I'll apologize in advance for asking you to limit the discussion to one of the many causes on which you've taken a leadership role in the California State Legislature. But I guess where I'd like you to start, if you can, from your perspective, is we've heard from a religious and community leader, we've heard from an educator. Senator Wiener is a legislator. How do you see your role in developing public policy to achieve the goals we've been talking about?
Yeah, it's, and I transitioned into elected office from many years as a community organizer, working in the nonprofit world, political world. And I view being an elected official, it's one part of the partnership that we have to have to make change. And so when I author legislation, my name is on the legislation and I spearhead that legislation, but it's really, often the result of a broad coalition. And it's a lot easier to pass strong legislation when you have a strong and diverse coalition behind that legislation. And so when we talk about trying to achieve social justice, trying to end homophobia and transphobia, trying to really protect our community, it's really a partnership with folks in the community when we, pursue legislation to protect trans kids and their families who might be fleeing other states because they're being threatened with criminalization, or legislation to ensure that healthcare is accessible for LGBTQ people, or we're working to decriminalize HIV, or to end discrimination against LGBTQ people on the sex offender registry. In a number of ways, we're working in broad partnership. And if it's just me as an elected official, I can do a lot, but it's most powerful when you have that coalition, and that I'm a part of that, and happy to do so.
Well, we're very, very grateful to have you here. And once again, grateful to have all three of you. But I think what you've all reminded me of is something that think we all know but often forget, is that when we talk about a community, whether the Jewish community, whether the LGBTQ plus community, or any other, a community, of course, as you each gently reminded me, is really just, it's a collection of individuals. And a community sounds like a sort of depersonalized organizational tool, but it's made up of human beings. And I think one of the real things that excited me most about this particular gathering of human beings on this panel today is that each of you, like many of us, brings such a compelling story to this discussion. And I'm wondering, Alisha, if you'd be willing to spend a couple of minutes just helping our audience understand not just why you do the work that you do, but a little bit about that path that you've been on, both as an individual and also as a parent.
Absolutely. And I'd say, I think there's three things that I'd like to share and connect about that. First is, I think a big part of why I do the work that I do, specifically in teen education, but also in working with JQ International in terms of trying to advocate for and create inclusive spaces in the Jewish community, is that I'm a big believer in being the adult that you needed as a young person. And part of that is creating visibility and helping young people see the many possibilities of who they can be and give them the words and the understandings for who they uniquely are. I will say I grew up in Simi Valley, California. I was one of the only Jews that I knew. Luckily, I went to Jewish summer camp. And those experiences there as part of Jewish community deeply impacted how I understood what it meant to be Jewish. But I didn't see that in my everyday necessarily. I was the only Jewish kid in my classroom. And also, growing up in the community I grew up in, there wasn't much visibility around LGBTQ plus identities. And so even the way I understood myself as a teenage girl was impacted by the examples that I saw. It wasn't until I was an adult and actually working with teens who started to give me more expansive understandings of different identities, where I was able to realize, like, oh, bisexuality, that's an identity. That is something that I didn't even know that I had the words for when I was younger, because I didn't see it. I didn't see it represented, and I didn't know how to name that. I think that visibility of all, like I said, all of these identities are important. It's part of why I do what I do. I will also say that for many years, I was part of leading the Los Angeles delegation of March of the Living, a Holocaust education trip to Poland and Israel. I was lucky to march alongside many survivors. And I will never forget the moment where I stood at a mass grave of 700 Jewish children in a place called Zolotovska Gora and looked into this grave, and as a mother tried to comprehend how it was possible for human beings to so distance themselves from the humanity of children because they were Jewish, that they were able to murder them in mass and throw them nameless into this grave. And in that moment, one of the things that I realized that my goal as an educator for the young people on this trip, and ever since then, has been about truly the most important thing that we can do to counter that possibility that exists in the world for that type of hatred and distancing and othering, is to find ways to deeply see humanity in others, and in every moment and in every interaction. That is the greatest thing that we can do, and recognizing the importance of that. It's been part of my work. And finally, I'm the mother of 2 teenage boys. And one of my most important jobs as a parent is to see them for who they are, support them for who they are, and give them the space to do that. And my youngest son came out as trans about 1.5 years ago. And that definitely doesn't make me an expert in the trans experience or in trans issues, but what it has done is made me double down on realizing as a parent how important it is to make sure that my children, and particular one of my children who might not be affirmed in their day-to-day lives for who they are, is to find the ways how important it is for young people to be seen for who they are and to feel that those identities are supported and accepted.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alisha. Senator Scott Wiener, one of the challenges, it's always seemed to me, of public service, particularly being an elected official, is when you lead these fights, you draw an awful lot of pushback. And I'm not just talking about people voting against your bills or speaking out against you on the floor of the state Senate, but you've faced some fairly unsettling, some fairly unnerving threats as a result of the commendable and courageous work that you've done. I wonder if you can talk a little bit, less as a legislator, more as an individual, about what it's like to have to navigate that kind of ugliness in order to work on behalf of things that are this important to you and us.
Yeah, it's been rough. In the last 2 years, I probably received several thousand death threats. It's to the point where I become sort of numb to them. This past Sunday, my office received a death threat with a bomb threat. So we had to have bomb sniffing dog come to my home. And it's I feel terrible for my staff because they have to screen a lot of these threats on social media, on email, by phone, reporting everything to CHP. There have been several prosecutions against people when they've been able to identify people making these threats, and these threats are pretty disgusting and atrocious. They're frequently homophobic, anti-Semitic, and they largely, some of them are about my vaccine-related work, but the large majority of them are about the work I do for the LGBTQ community and for people living with HIV. So I authored a law in 2017 to decriminalize HIV, to get rid of these specific felonies targeting people with HIV that were passed in the 80s and early 90s. Legislation to end discrimination against LGBTQ young people who are being forced into the sex offender registry. Legislation to, as I mentioned, legislation to ensure better training for people providing care to transgender people, and so forth. And more recently, my public defense of drag queens, because it seems like every few months there's a new outrage that the right-wing outrage machine targets. It's been trans kids for a while. Now it's drag queens. Texas, a state representative who just less than 2 weeks after 19 children were massacred in a classroom decided that the top threat to kids in Texas was not guns, but drag shows. And so, I've seen firsthand that this just base hatred against queer people is alive and well. It's been liberated. People say all sorts of things now that just 4 or 5 years ago we thought were just not acceptable in any discourse, and now it's all over the internet. And the thing is, I'm an elected official. It's rough to have to deal with this and to see this, but I'm also, elected official. I'm used to being attacked and criticized, and I also have access to resources. We have contact with CHP. We have, et cetera, et cetera. We can call senior San Francisco police folks if we need to. But if you're just a regular person who's being, doxxed and threatened and disparaged online, there's not a lot. You don't have those resources. And particularly when LGBTQ kids see this, they're not living in a cave. They see the attacks. They see that they're being called scam artists or pedophiles or whatever else. And these kids see that. The trans kids who see that, because of who they are, they may get put in foster care and their parents put in prison. And it isn't any wonder that we have higher rates of self-harm among LGBTQ kids compared to other kids. So it's really just these words have consequences. And so we're preparing for another wave because yesterday or today, Marjorie Taylor Greene did one of her online talk shows, and she went after me personally that Wiener is trying to chop off kids' wieners or something like that, and so we're prepared for a wave coming from that. These words have consequences, and the politicians and right-wing activists who are doing this, it's so cynical. And whether it's so they can get elected to higher office or so that they can drive engagement on their social media and make more money, they're doing it at the expense of other people.
I learned a long time ago that the measure of an individual are the enemies they make, but it can't be easy to go through, and we give you tremendous credit and admiration for the way you've persevered and continued.
Thank you.
Rabbi Eger, Scott Wiener was just talking, he used the phrase, just a regular person. And when Alisha was talking earlier, she was discussing her own experience being young and not knowing where to turn. So where do people turn when they don't know where to turn? They turn to a spiritual leader. In our community, they turn to a rabbi. And for 35 years now, as you reminded us, they've turned to you. So you've been dealing with these issues on a personal level every day in your congregation and the community. What can you tell us about what you see and hear when just a regular person comes to you for advice and guidance on how to proceed?
Thank you, Dan. And I want to say, Senator Wiener, we're really proud of the work that you do each and every day. And we are here for you. As you're going through this. I have a file full of letters and death threats that have come through these 35 years, of articles that were printed in the Jewish Journal back in the early 90s when they called me the lesbian pig rabbi. Another rabbi called me that here in LA, and they printed it in the Jewish Journal. So I understand what this is like to have your family threatened, to have you threatened by people both outside of the Jewish community and within the Jewish community at times. And as a parent who raised a son who's now in his late 20s, who had two moms and a gay dad, it wasn't easy for him back then. And he's a proud member of our ally of our LGBTQ community, having grown up in the midst of it. And so this is not something that's just on paper. Right, those right-wing activists that you make mention of, Senator, we're talking about real people here in real lives that are affected by the literally evil words that they are using to instigate and to threaten and to create havoc in our real lives and our LGBTQ community plus communities' lives. And it has real consequences. And I do see there are increased attempts at self-harm within the LGBTQ community, not only among our youth, but among adults. There's been a higher usage of drugs and alcohol in the LGBTQ community. Why? Because of this level of hatred and vitriol that gets woven through society at times by the laws that we've had through the years, and then we see this increase. I want to tell you a quick story. My wife is a rabbi in Austin, Texas, Rabbi Eleanor Steinman. And in these last year, as these bills, particularly in Texas, Texas, has come forward. She has had to help the families of trans youth build what is known as safe files. Why? Because the way that the policy that's been put forward by their governor and their state attorney general, it's not a law, it's not legislation, it's a policy to have child family services investigate the parents of trans kids for child abuse, and as Senator Wiener said, to remove trans kids from their homes and put them into the foster care system, and to deny them gender appropriate medical care. Giving them gender appropriate medical care is seen as child abuse. So she has had to run workshops in her congregation for the families to build a case file. This isn't something that we're talking about maybe if is going to happen. It is already happening to families of trans kids, and they want to extend it to lesbian and gay and non-binary kids. So, in California, sometimes we feel safe and lucky. Oh, California is so welcoming. Oh, California is such a great state. And it is, and it isn't. Because there are plenty of corners of our state where it is still not safe for LGBTQ kids and adults. There are plenty parts, even within our own Jewish community, where LGBTQ plus people are not welcome and not supported. And so it is important for us to remember that there are daily practical implications for the well-being of LGBTQ people and LGBTQ plus Jews in the way we work together and the way we treat one another. And I think it's really, really important, especially as we're observing this Pride Month nationwide here in June, that if you are listening to this and you don't know anything about the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, non-binary, genderqueer, intersex, and questioning communities, this is a time to get some education, because sexual orientation and gender identity and gender expression are not the same thing. And there's lots of lesson plans, lots of ways to learn about this that is age appropriate, I might add, whether you're an adult or a teen or a junior high school student, that are age appropriate, and to learn more about what we're talking about here. I had the privilege to publish a book called Mishkan Ga'ava in Hebrew, Where Pride Dwells. It means it is the first collection of LGBTQ Jewish prayers and rituals for our community. Has everything in it. It's not a siddur, it's not a prayer book, but is a collection of prayers and rituals and ceremonies and essays that take our Jewish language and weave that into the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender plus identities and voices. And so one of the things that we wrote is a study guide that has 4 lessons in it that absolutely help both, that are aimed at teens and adults, that help explain and learn more about the differences between sexual orientation and gender identity from an inclusive Jewish perspective. So that's widely available. The study guide is free for download as an educational resource for teachers, for adults. Maybe you have a chavarah in your community, in your synagogue that you might want to learn together, and that makes this really clear. And it's available at the Central Conference of American Rabbis, the Reform Movement Rabbis Press, ccarpress.org, and the study guide is free for download.
Rabbi, thank you very much. And I do want to ask you some follow-up questions about that study guide, because it sounds absolutely fascinating. Senator Wiener, I know you're going to have to leave us a little bit early in just a few minutes, but there was one point that the rabbi made that I really wanted to get your perspective on. She talked about the practical impact of this hate, and you talked about it also. But of course, this isn't just personal and individual. There's data to back this up. And in fact, there's been a tremendous increase in the amount of anti-LGBTQ plus hate crimes, assaults against members of the community. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the rise in that violence. You've addressed it a bit earlier from a legislative perspective, but talk a little bit about what that rise in violence means and what we can do to help protect those who deserve our protection. Oh, Senator, I believe you're on mute.
Sorry about that. As I said before, these actions and words have consequences. And so we have seen an increase in hate crime attacks, violence, bullying in schools. When you look at, like, we focus a lot on the trans kids, but we look at the Don't Say Gay law in Florida, which is now being introduced in other states. That's for all children. Like, if you are a third grader and you have two moms, you're not allowed to talk about it in school. And if your teacher talks about it or it becomes a topic of discussion, teacher can get in trouble, the school can get in trouble, the school can get sued, someone can get fired. And so it creates a state of fear. We're not allowed to talk about that. And that also sends a signal to kids that, oh, these other kids who might be queer are lesser, there's something wrong with them. It's something gross, something you can't talk about. And so that leads to bullying. And so that's why, Ron DeSantis, one of the most absolute despicable human beings I've ever seen, just beyond queer stuff, the way he treats other people. But specifically here, he's trying to become president on the backs of these children. And that is, I know in Judaism, we don't really necessarily believe in hell, but if there were a hell, there would be a special place for people like that who try to build their careers or their followings on the backs of children who are just trying to be who they are and live their lives.
Senator Wiener, we know you have another obligation. You're going to have to leave us a little bit early, but we're very grateful to you, not just for the time that you spent with us tonight, but for all the work you've done and continue to do on behalf of so many important causes and communities in California and beyond. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it. Have a good evening. Bye.
And for our audience, just as we continue our conversation with Rabbi Denise Eger and Alisha Pedowitz, if any of you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the Q&A function on Zoom. And I'll do my best to make sure to get to those questions before we wind up for the evening. Rabbi Eger, I apologize for cutting you off earlier, but I knew the senator was going to have to leave. But I really do want to hear more about the study guide, and I do think that our audience will also. But I think I'll broaden the question also, not only given the study guide that you put together, but more broadly, how can Jewish community organizations, for that matter, how can individuals in the Jewish community make more of a difference? What can we be doing? What should we be doing?
Well, that's a really great question, and I think it's more than just it's Pride Month. We see a lot of corporations change their logos to rainbow logos and put out merchandise, and a lot of Jewish organizations also changed their logos to show their support. And while that is an important signal, it has to go much deeper than simply changing a logo or marching in a pride parade. There are systemic changes that have to be made within our Jewish institutions and in the Jewish community, and that is to invite LGBTQ plus Jews into the leadership of the community. We have to look at and examine the policies that are promulgated within a particular institution and how it looks, how a Jewish organization invests their money. Are they investing their money in companies that take stands against LGBTQ people, like Chick-fil-A is a good example, or Hobby Lobby is another business, and how is your money invested? And so it goes really deeply into understanding that there is a right-wing agenda in this country that will that, as Senator Wiener specifically spoke about, with many of with the governor of Florida in particular is a great example, who are trying to make a grandiose statement about their own political careers at the expense of LGBTQ people and kids. And so I think the Jewish community has an obligation to speak up and say enough. Enough. This is not, if you want to be president, if you want to run for office, tell us what you stand for and not to foment hatred against others. I mean, this is a program of the Holocaust Museum of Los Angeles. And we've learned so many lessons from the Shoah and from those years about the rise of the Nazi regime and how they made Jews other, how they made gay people other, how they made the Roma people other. And so if we don't take those lessons seriously within our own Jewish community, when now a new class of political class rises up and again targets a group of people, then shame on us. We haven't learned a thing when we run around saying never again. So LGBTQ people are under assault in the United States of America again. And it is time for the Jewish community to stand up and say, we're not going to have this. We've learned the lessons of the Holocaust. We're not going to have this again.
And of course, what you're talking about, and Alisha, you referenced this briefly a little bit earlier, is the famous Martin Niemöller poem. And then they came for me. And there was no one left to speak for me. Very quickly, before we go back to Alisha, I do just want to remind our audience that the museum, of course, is a nonprofit organization, and therefore we are not necessarily nonpartisan, but multipartisan. And we welcome viewpoints from across the ideological spectrum, particularly when they speak to the goals of building bridges. And so, for those of you who've joined us in the past, you know we've heard from progressives and conservatives alike talking about these broad goals. Rabbi Eger and Senator Wiener, obviously to their credit, have very, very strong opinions, but we welcome those from across the spectrum. We as an organization don't take sides on the partisan political discussion. We do take sides very strongly when it comes to making sure that those bridges are built to welcome those with whom we can work toward our common goals.
You know, Dan, I just want to say one thing. Being conservative in your political view does not necessarily make one a homophobe. And I think, or anti-gay. And so I want to be clear. My statements were not about being partisan. My statements were very clear that we cannot have politicians using hatred against LGBTQ people and kids as their platform for a rise in there. And that would go from the right or the left. I want to be really clear about it. Just because one holds conservative political views does not make one anti-gay. And so I want to be very clear that my statement was about hatred and being targeting of LGBTQ people that's going on in this country. It happens to be at the moment coming from a particular right-wing political viewpoint, but not all people who are conservative by any means are anti-gay, and so I want to be very, very clear about that.
No, I'm so glad you clarified. I knew that was the intent of your comments and Senator Wiener's as well. But just as a reminder, not only to our audience, but to our lawyers, we are a nonpartisan, multi-partisan organization. So Alisha, I'm going to ask you to take on what might be the more difficult part of this round of questioning. Rabbi Eger, I think in a very compelling way, talked about the various things that organizations can do in this space. I'm going to ask you if you can talk about this on a more individual basis. And one of the things that struck me in our previous conversations is the types of things that often get overlooked but can't. The questions relating to gender affirming care, why those things are so important. Why using the most appropriate pronouns are so important. for our audience members who've heard these discussions, maybe you can take us a little bit deeper and help us understand why these decisions are so important at a personal level.
Absolutely, Dan. And I also just want to link back to even what Rabbi Eger was just saying, that on a personal level, one of the things that we can do is recognize that these issues that are a matter of simply affirming and accepting and supporting people for who they are have become politicized and turned into propaganda. And most of the conversations that are happening at the political level are filled with some form of propaganda that isn't actually about what's happening. And so being informed and listening, not taking that at face value, and really turning to the voices who are people who have lived experiences with the different identities and the issues is the most important way you can get information and counter that. And as Jews, we know that propaganda on identity can be used against us, and that's exactly what is happening here. But then the other piece of what you're asking about at an individual level, you ask about gender affirming care and what that means. I'll take a step back, and I think I want to reference what Senator Wiener said a little while ago in terms of words have consequences. And we know that to be true in any number of ways. And in the work that I do at Moving Traditions, which is a national organization that works in teen Jewish education, I'm the director of teen education there. One of the things that we look at is trying to understand how we best support the overall wellness, wholeness, well-being. We call shleimut, the Jewish value of wholeness, how we support that for teens in our programs. And one of the things that we do is pay attention to what we call, what research tells us about protective factors in mental health. What are the different things that we can do to help protect young people against all of the things that impact their mental health so that we can support them from a wellness standpoint? And when in some of the groups that we run, which are called Tselem, coming from B'Tselem Elohim in God's image, for trans, non-binary, and LGBTQ plus teens, the particular data that we are looking at comes from the Trevor Project, an organization that's really dedicated to the mental health of LGBTQ plus youth. And they put out each year a mental health study of LGBTQ plus youth in the country. And really the data that comes out every year, and in particular this year, tells us that 45% of LGBTQ plus youth in this country in the past year seriously considered suicide. And those numbers are even higher for trans and non-binary youth. More than 50% have seriously considered suicide. Conversely, the number one factor that halved the likelihood that they would have seriously considered suicide is if they have family and friends who support and affirm their identities. So gender affirming care is related to this. When we use the word affirming, affirmation, we are saying what we are doing is providing support and encouragement and understanding for who someone is and what they need to that. And one of the key ways that we help LGBTQ plus young people navigate this world where they are hearing assaults on who they are through legislation, through all of these things, of course they are, their mental health is being impacted by that. One of the ways that we can drastically protect them is by saying that we see you and we affirm you and we accept you for who we are. And that's backed up by the data. Gender affirming care is a term that has also been politicized and used as propaganda. All it refers to is the wide array of services, mental health, medical, non-medical, social, emotional, any form of services that help someone be affirmed for who they are. And in particular, when it comes to gender identity, having providers who understand the experiences of trans youth and how that intersects with mental health, physical health, medical, et cetera, et cetera. That's what gender affirming care refers to. It's anyway, and then the last thing is, as individuals, respecting pronouns. Pronouns are how we refer to someone, right? I'm a she, I use she, her pronouns, he, they, or he, him pronouns. A lot of non-binary youth are using they, them to say, I am, my gender is more expansive, and there's any range of all kinds of other pronouns in truth that are being used. Language is the way that we convey meaning to one another. One of the most important ways that we can convey, I see you, I support you, I understand you, is in the language that we use when we talk to one another. Pronouns are one of the very simple ways that we can do that. And it can be hard because we're learning new language, some of us, but trying to learn that language. We're going to drop in the chat. Actually, I want to just give 2 resources. JQ International's helpline, which actually helps provide mental health and wellness services specific to the LGBTQ+ community and allies. And at Moving Traditions, a page of resources for adults who are trying to understand and demystify the language on gender, more than we can get to here, but please feel free to look at those resources.
And I'll let our audience know that for those of you who might not be cutting and pasting all that quickly at 5:59 at night, don't worry, we'll send a follow-up email with information relating to JQ International, with information relating to the study guide and the work that Rabbi Eger's been doing on many other fronts, as well as Senator Wiener's legislative highlights. So rest assured, you'll be getting an email from our amazing team at the museum tomorrow with this follow-up information. We're coming up right at the top of the hour, and I'm really frustrated because I feel like we've just scratched the surface on a conversation that we could continue to take forward for the next several hours. That's not going to happen, unfortunately, at least not tonight. But Rabbi Denise Eger, Alisha Pedowitz of JQ International, we're so grateful to have you here with us tonight. We hope you'll come back and talk to us again in the future. As you both referenced very politely, these are issues that we shouldn't just be talking about 1 month a year, but need to be talking about 12 months a year. And so we really do hope you'll come back and join us again in the future. So thanks to both of you for being with us. Thanks to Senator Scott Wiener for being with us as well. Thanks not only to Beth Keane, but to the entire incredible team she has with us at the museum. And a special shout out to Fanny for stepping in and helping us through this month's program. We're very grateful to you. But most importantly, once again, we're grateful to you as an audience. Thank you for joining us for these programs. We'll be back here again in about a month on Thursday, July 14th for our next Building Bridges discussion. And of course, we hope you'll be willing to join us at the museum when your schedule allows to see why this has become so important to so many of us. Hope you all have a wonderful evening. We'll look forward to seeing you again in July. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you, and happy Pride.